Alright, so welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to take a look at the 8XX and we're going to be comparing them to my babies, the HD600. So I'm not going to provide a whole lot of background for this one. Here's what's on the chopping block today. The HD600s, you know them, you love them, or at least I hope so. They're classics and they're very hard to beat. Decades later, they're still quite competent in most aspects. The HD8XX, the new kids on the block, the cursed love child of Sennheiser and Massdrop, born into infamy and still lingers in its murky waters. And so, let's not waste any more time. Let's get into it. Contents, build quality, and comfort. You know, it's funny how the HD600 actually gives you more of a variety when it comes to connectivity, with letting you connect them to a 4-inch port as well as a 3.5mm port. From a build quality standpoint, at first they seem very similar. Once you start looking into them though, you'll notice the tiny little details that make a difference. On the 8XX, the hinges feel smoother, the velour on the cups and headband feel a lot softer. Not that that justifies an entire 4x price hike though. Now in terms of comfort, this one really depends on the user. I'll have you know I find the HD600 a lot more comfortable than the HD800 line. The ratio of weight, clamp force, and cup size are much better on the HD600. They never feel like they're gonna fall off, all while not overextending and placing too much pressure on outer portions of my head. Now while I'm sure most would probably prefer the massive cups and lighter clamp force of the 8XX, I find them to be less comfortable just because they slide off of your head far too easily and place pressure on the lower portion of my jawline and forward portion of my temples where the glasses lie. And don't even get me started on that ultra thick cable on the 8XX either. Seriously, Sennheiser, address that issue. Told you we weren't going to waste any time here. Let's jump into the sound portion. So once again, the following results were taken without the use of any EQ. Any EQ adjustments will be discussed at the notes and observations portion of this review. Now with that out of the way, let's begin. Amplification. Let's just address amplification quickly. On the THX AAA 789, I ran both the HD600 and the 8XX at around 11 AM. That makes sense considering they both have 300 ohms of impedance. So let's start off with the bass. So you'll be surprised to hear this, but the HD600 actually have a warmer and fuller bass response than the 8XX. You know, it's funny. Typically, the HD600 tends to be the less bass-oriented headphone between the two headphones being compared. See, here's the issue. While the 600 aren't necessarily incredibly warm or anything, at least their timbre is warm-ish. The 8XX is just dead in this regard. While there's a respectable amount of slam to it, there are essentially no waves created after each impact the way bass usually works, if that makes any sense. So I listened to Kyoto by Skrillex featuring Syra, and when I got to the 8XX, all I could think of was that one clip of Armin from Attack on Titan putting his own hand down. Drums and bass guitar, same thing. The 8XX just sounds far less natural. The drums comparatively sound lifeless and kinda 2D. The bass guitar lacks that rumble that gives it that rugged texture. Now kick drums, while still on the conservative side on the HD600, still have more authority and kick to them than the 8XX. And it's not that the 8XX drivers are incapable of producing detail. I know they can. I'm definitely not saying that HD600 drivers are better than the 8XXs. They're definitely not. It's just clear to hear that while the HD600 sound signature aims for a natural, kind of somewhat pleasing sound, the 8XX goes for a sterile type of sound instead. Yeah, I can't emphasize enough how absolutely sterile the 8XX sounds compared to the juicier flavor of the HD600. Now let's jump into mids. You know, I'm not one to really rag about the mids. It's not one of those points that I'm like, oh, the mids are like this and this, so I hate it, and no. But I gotta say, the difference here is definitely something to discuss. So in a nutshell, when comparing these two, what I'm hearing is that playful EQ setting that goes by the name of phonograph or telephone. You've seen it on your smartphone, like, oh, you can select an EQ setting, and then they have that phonograph setting, the one that makes the mids sound like they're coming from like a tube, you know, kind of like a old-timey-ish kind of sound. Same thing here. Here's the thing though, there's nothing wrong with the quality of the mids. In fact, the mids sound clearer and more discernible on the 8XX than on the 600. The problem is, They also lack pretty much every little bit of life and twang to it. Let's put it this way. If music is art, then this is the closest to a blank piece of paper with black ink as you will probably get. I was listening to Dream On by the Postmodern Jukebox, their cover, and I flipped along to the cello solo at 2:31. On the 8XX, the cello stood more isolated, within its own space, and sounded much clearer and defined. That's good. But it lost its color and vibrance along the way. It was no longer a cello in a song, but just a mere set of notes in a recording. Female vocal sounded hollow and empty, just a mere husk of what once was. Not to get all poetic on you, but you know. Now let's discuss the treble. So this one is a bit of a disappointment too. If you followed me for a while, you know I'm not a fan of really intense treble. It's just not my thing. I happen to believe the amount of treble forwardness on the HD600 happens to be perfection, with the exception of the bit of veil added to the topmost layer of air, but it is what it is. The 8XX do go past this amount of treble just a bit, but definitely don't get to sound harsh in any way. Now the consonant region is more pronounced on the 8XX, but it's still within a level of acceptance where you won't need to EQ it out. Same goes for the air on the headphone. I'd say I welcome the extra air if I'm being honest, but instruments like cymbals and hi-hats are a little more forward on the 8XX and are a bit smoother and clearer to listen to. Ultimately though, it all comes down to the same thing I keep mentioning thus far. Timbre. The combination of a slightly forward treble response and an oppressed sound signature form a thin and sharp response that isn't all that bad, but can be a lot better. Soundstage and imaging. Well, this one's very easy. It's exactly what you'd expect when you pit an HD600 against an HD800. The 8XX have a much larger soundstage and much better imaging, hands down. While imaging on an HD600 is definitely good, it's nowhere near the legendary levels of the 8XX line. I mean, the 8XX show you those micro details within each track and allow for such clinical detail to come out. As for soundstage, the 8XX line is known for having a massive soundstage, while the HD6XX line is known for having a narrow soundstage. Some people may prefer a more intimate experience, and that's a respectable decision. It's a sound characteristic, not a flaw. But most will opt for the more impressive grand sound of the 8XX, myself included. Having that space available for sounds to coexist in a separate but equal kind of way allows each instrument to really shine and stand out rather than present itself as part of a group. Now let's get to some notes here. I'm going to start off with EQ. While I'm sure some people might make a few modifications to the HD600, I would personally not touch them whatsoever. I'm touching them now. Their timbre and presence are already quite exemplary, to my ears at least. As for the 8XX, well, that's an entirely different matter. They do require quite a bit of adjusting, but in the end, all of that actually makes quite a bit of difference. As I mentioned in the individual review, the purpose of this setting is to increase overall warmth in the bass and improve that hollowed out dip in the mids. Does it accomplish the goal? It definitely helps, but I wouldn't say it entirely fixes it either. And so we get to the conclusion. Of course, this video isn't about determining whether you should spend 4 times as much on the 8XX as opposed to staying with the 600, like, which is the better value? No, kinda obvious. This video is more about the comparison between each portion of sound. So, to summarize, the HD600 have some of the best timbre you will find on a headphone. It's natural, it's balanced, and it pushes the energy as far as can go without introducing any sort of fatigue. The 8XX has some of the wackiest timbre you will find on a headphone from a mainstream audio company. Through EQ, you can manage to bring it close to a natural sound, though it's still nowhere near the levels of the HD600. That said, you do have a lot to gain from going to the 8XX. You get a spicier treble, if you're into that. You get a much wider soundstage alongside some incredible imaging, which can be a benefit for something like gaming. And with those EQ adjustments, you also get some adequate lows and mids. Now that said, I'm still planning on daily driving my HD600s just because they're the better all-rounder for me. No EQ to adjust, no special conditions to be met, and its comfort and clamp force works for any sort of situation, whether you're sitting, standing, looking down, etc. You can wear them around the house, it doesn't matter. That versatility is invaluable to me. And so thus concludes my comparison of these two bad boys. So let me know what you think. Let me know if you have any additional questions down below, something you'd like me to answer regarding the comparison between these two. And hey, don't forget to stick around. Coming up very, very soon, the comparison between these and its ancestors. That's right. I've got the HD800 and the HD800S, and I've had those with me for months just for this comparison. So stay tuned. And that takes care of that. Thank you very much for watching. I really hope this helped your purchasing decision, and see you in the next one. Okay, ciao.